of people who are not only watching it from the distance, but actually were at the midst of this from 2014. They will bring us some clarity, I'm sure of that. Next to me is Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who has held all political positions possible but the president of Ukraine, I'd say. He was the governor of the National Bank, he was the foreign minister, he was the speaker of the parliament, and when Russia attacked Ukraine back in 2014, after the Revolution of Dignity, he was the prime minister of Ukraine. Welcome, Arseniy. Now he is the founder of Open Ukraine Foundation. I had an honor working with him and starting in 2007 Kyiv Security Forum. It's not the first time Arseniy speaks to us. I actually can tell exactly that it was 317 days ago, because it was 1,000 days of Russian invasion when we had an online session about where we are. And next to him is our own and only Kir Giles, who is the associate fellow with Russia and Eurasia program. And he is a long-time Russia watcher and explainer, sometimes to a frustrated measure, because his analysis is well read but rarely acted upon, I'd say. But he keeps at it, and he is the author of his most recent book is called Who Will Defend Europe? And I must say, I'm moved that this book is dedicated, as Kir says, to the Ukrainian people who at immense cost have formed the front line for the defense of Europe. So we thank all the Ukrainian defenders for what they are doing today to keep Russia's threat at bay for all of us here in London. So Arseniy, I would like to start with, because of the title of our session, how would you define what is a win for Ukraine in this war?
Well, first, Arisia, I'm very grateful that you made it possible to address the Chatham House. And frankly speaking, I am very lucky, because you did the same with President Zelensky. And I am sitting near Sir Kir. We have two Sir Kirs, Kir and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So I feel like being practically not far from my president.
Right.
So how would I define it? The very survival of the Ukrainian state is the victory for Ukraine.
Okay.
NATO membership is the victory for Ukraine. EU membership is the victory for Ukraine. And ironclad security guarantees, and that's the reason why I mentioned NATO membership, because I don't buy any kind of another special purpose vehicles for the security guarantees. Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. These I would assess as, and last but not least, to bring Russia to justice. Justice must be served. And designated war criminal Putin and an entire Putin's regime have to be held accountable. So this is the set of measures and my vision of Ukraine's victory.
You mentioned, just to develop a little bit, Ukraine's survival, but surely some people say survival isn't enough. Do you believe that if Ukraine integrates with the European Union and NATO, it will be able to actually, build back better, flourish economically, bring back its people, because it has lost quite a lot. It is taking a heavy cost of this invasion?
Well, that's exactly the reason why I indicated both EU and NATO membership. Survival means a flourishing and vibrant Ukraine.
Okay.
Survival means security for the Ukrainian people. Survival means prosperity for the Ukrainian people and for the Ukrainian economy. So it is a comprehensive definition. But the reason why I mentioned survival, because war criminal Putin, he wants to annihilate Ukraine. So for him, this is a genocidal war. Have you seen him yesterday delivering some kind of stupid stuff in Valdai? So for the second time, it is not for the second. For a number of times, Putin has mentioned Nazi criminals as heroes. I don't know whether you remember when he said that Goebbels was quite a smart guy. It is in the YouTube. And you know what yesterday he said? That it is due to Poland, Nazi regime started the Second World War because Polish people refused to cede Gdansk corridor. He said it publicly. So the guy is completely obsessed with, it's not even imperial, but with the fascist and Nazi policy against the free world. And he is very open about that. he always speaks openly about everything. Even in 2007 at this notorious Munich security conference. You remember when he said that it was the biggest disaster of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And my beloved Western friends were just deaf. They were thinking that he is kidding, you know. In the end, we have what we have.
So what you are saying is reminding us that Putin's goals go beyond Ukraine. Clearly, he wants to annihilate Ukraine, but his ideological and imperialist agenda stretches beyond the borders of Ukraine, threatens other neighboring countries and those that are already in NATO and European Union. That's why it's good to bring in Keir now, because what we hear often that it will be up to Ukraine to decide the parameters of this victory and how it wants to end the war. But surely, if this war takes place in Europe, we in the West also have some vested interest in the outcome. Could you say what kind of outcome you would like to see for Europe in this war that would secure Europe rather than make it more vulnerable?
Well, since we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, if you'll forgive me a minor digression, it's probably a good time to mention how Chatham House is going to be addressing that problem, because we have a new leader of a combined program bringing together the remnants of the Russia-Eurasia program, including the Forum, and the Europe program into a Europe and Russia program with a new leader. We should welcome Mr. Grégoire Rousse, who has just arrived in this building and will be perfectly placed to treat that question as a priority, because it is the outcome of the war on Ukraine that will define the future of Europe for decades. Now, we are told by Bronwyn Maddox, our director, Mr. Rousse does speak Russian, which is natural enough since it will be essential for the job he is going to do. And I'm very much looking forward to meeting him and to hearing his vision for how Chatham House can bring together those two elements, Europe, including Ukraine, Northern Asia, including Russia, and foster those two vital interlinked goals of promoting Europe's defense and Russia's defeat. Which brings me back to the question. It's one of those questions which has had the same answer since February 2022 or before, but it keeps getting asked because the answer is not one that our decision makers in Europe and North America can understand the implications of and act on. It has always been the case that the scale and extent of Russia's strategic setback, whatever it suffers in Ukraine, will determine the scale and extent of Europe's breathing space before Russia moves again. And that covers a huge range of possible outcomes. There is the survival of Ukraine, which in itself is a victory when Russia is seeking so hard to destroy it, at one extreme, however you define it, whether it is the full engagement of Ukraine with all of these structures to which it has the right to belong, or simply continuing to resist, to be resilient, to defy Russia. Any of those is a victory. At the other extreme, there are options that are probably by now off the table. Now, a lot of people in this room have heard already the story of how a senior diplomat in London years ago, briefed people from this organization at the end of his tour on what it would take to turn Russia into a country that was no longer intent on invading and destroying its neighbors. He had a policy prescription. He said, what you need to do, referring to the Western allies, what you need to do is do to Russia what you did to Germany and Japan. Wage total war on it, bomb it flat, invade it, occupy it for a period not just of decades but of generations, completely rewrite its constitution, overhaul its educational system, re-educate the public, and then, after several generations, you will have a country that can live at peace with its neighbors. Now that is not going to happen. So the best case outcome is somewhere else along that spectrum. But the worst case outcome in the long term is for there to be something that appears like a victory in the terms of end of hostilities, which allows European leaders to convince themselves that the problem has gone away. If there is a ceasefire without conditions, if there is an end to the war which cements Russian gains in place, if the major combat operations cease, and then Europe thinks we can take our foot off the throttle for rearmament, for building our resilience, for preparing ourselves for the next time Russia seeks to attack a neighbor, then we will be in even deeper trouble than we were before. So that question of what exactly the Ukrainian victory looks like is absolutely crucial for Europe's future defense and security, as it always has been.
Thank you very much for kind of outlining it. And here I would like to move to the area that has been preoccupying a lot of people hopeful that there could be a settlement, especially when Trump came to office this year. He was very resolute that he wants to end this war, that he'll somehow have this relationship with Putin that will stop the killing of people. I, for one thing, genuinely, he wanted to stop the killing. It's not going according to the plan. And actually, I see the relations between the Alaska summit when Putin was brought out the cold, and now the escalation and disruption of major airports, the drones and the cyber attacks within NATO territory. But if we take for a moment this assumption that that the only way this war will end is through the negotiated settlement with Russia, right? Surely it cannot be defeated, some people say. So Ukraine will have to sit at the table, will have to negotiate with whoever is in the Kremlin. Arseniy, you have spent a lot of time, with Minsk agreements that Ukraine had about 200 rounds after the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbass. Do you believe there could be any pressure that could be put on Putin to actually negotiate in honest way with Ukraine?
Well, the first time I met Putin face to face, it was in 2005. Mm-hmm. He has changed, definitely, but the thing is that this is a very cunning, foxy and sneaky KGB operative. And we have to realize, our Western friends have to realize, it is too late to realize. And he plays with the people, he easily scrutinizes them, he reads the psychology of the counterparts, so he's good at that. That's what he was actually studied in the KGB institutions. You mentioned negotiations. Look, give me a break. There is no negotiations at all. Mm-hmm. They've pretended. It was a sham negotiations. They sent a no-name to Istanbul, if I'm not mistaken, to pretend that they are acting in a good faith. And there was only one person aimed at getting this kind of signal. And it was President Trump. So Putin's idea was very clear, to drag his feet, to play all of us, and mainly President Trump, and to do his best in order to avoid the next round of sanctions and in order to avoid escalations with the new US administration. So that's the first point. The second one, you mentioned that there are a number of pundits and folks who say that, look, this war could be settled at the negotiating table via the diplomatic solution. I don't buy it at all. This war won't be settled by diplomacy. And here is the reason why. We are completely irreconcilable. He wants to kill us, and we want to live. Tell me, where could we find the common ground? Maybe we should find some kind of extraordinary diplomat who will provide us this kind of common ground. But I am not sure that he exists on this earth. So, going back to the question you've raised, there is only one way to make Ukraine to win. And with all due respect, you said that it's up to Ukraine to decide the terms and conditions of the peace.
That's what we hear often.
Yeah, and I like this. I like this kind of statement, and I really admire. But here is the thing. If we are let alone to decide, Putin will get what he wants. And he wants an entire Ukraine. And he is ready to cut the deal. He is ready to get so-called peace at any price for Ukraine, but at the best price for him, with the capitulation of Ukraine. So we desperately need your support. I mean, the support of the Western world. And that's what he was playing for. He expected that the US administration will turn its back on Ukraine and that there will be a huge fragility within the European Union, which we actually witness right now, okay? Undecisiveness, never-ending talk shops. And in this way, this kind of the war of attrition will deliver the best result for Putin, which is Ukraine and the restoration of the Soviet Union. And last but not least, you've just mentioned Putin, I mean Russia. Yeah. That it is Russia that is waging the war. let me provide you with the bigger scope. It is not Russia. This is an international conflict. China is providing a lifeline to Russia. China is supporting this war. China is an accomplice in this war. China is a key partner of North Korea that deployed its troops against Ukraine and provides an ammo in this war against Ukraine. China is an ally to Iran. So, given that, look, China, Russia, and another pariahs, they present a totalitarian regime that is fighting against the democracy and the free world. So this is the definition of this conflict. It is not just Russo-Ukrainian war. It is bigger.
Yes, thanks for bringing that perspective. And now, if Kira, I ask you the same question, but more building on Arseny's response, how can we change the calculus on Putin in this war through hard power, if it's not through negotiations and appealing to the costs that he is already encountering? I remember I was told at the beginning of the war by one of the East European foreign ministers that he thought if Russians would lose 500,000 men in Ukraine, they would end the war. But I said, surely Russians are counting losses more in tanks and in equipment than in men. And we are not inflicting high enough damage to Russia. So what it is that could either deny Russia capability to wage the war or change its calculus?
Well, sadly, in spite of all the evidence, the idea that this war can be brought to an end through negotiations refuses to die. I lost count of the number of times I was doing media interviews over a period of extended months asking me to comment on the peace talks, quote unquote, the negotiations. And when I said, what negotiations? They are not happening. There is no point of contact. There is no discussion that is actually going to lead to any kind of outcome that you have in mind. Everybody was terribly confused because the presentation of what Russia was doing was not just for the audience of Trump. It also was very natural for global media to engage in this process and pretend that something was happening. But it was well before the end of 2022 that the then Ukrainian commander, Valery Zaluzhny, identified that the center of gravity for confronting Russia was, in fact, bringing it home to ordinary Russians, that the war was not something that was being waged on their behalf a long way away for exterminating Ukrainians, that we can all cheer and it won't affect us, but would in fact affect Ukrainian society and
Russian society.
Excuse me, Russian society. And the calculus behind that is that the only way to induce the Russian leadership to end the war is to present a challenge which is a threat to that grip on power of Vladimir Putin. Now, this is something which we see Ukraine developing on a daily basis, bringing home to ordinary Russians that this affects them. For example, by making sure that they cannot buy petrol to fuel their cars. But it's also
that is already happening to a degree.
Exactly. It's also something which Ukraine's foremost Western backers were trying hard to oppose under the previous US administration, for example, that had reached the conclusion, partly as a result of how Russia was presenting this war, reached the conclusion that it was more dangerous to allow Russia to be defeated than for a neighbor of Russia to be destroyed. And that is still a mental block that it is hard for some backers of Ukraine to overcome. Is it possible to defeat Russia? Of course it is. Will people do it? That's a whole other question. Whether there is the will across Europe to actually recognize what is at stake and take steps accordingly is a whole other question. Now, we know what Russia is concerned about. Let's look at what's been happening in Denmark over the course of this month. Denmark identifies what it is that deters Russia, long-range precision strike to hold at risk things that matter to Russia. Russia has hysterics as a result. Starts the nuclear threats, and then a few days later, drones mysteriously appear over Copenhagen Airport. We know this matters to them because not only of the concepts of deterrence and war termination that they have written about at enormous length over the previous decade, but also how they react when it happens. So it can be done. The question is, will it?
Yeah, and just to bring in the question from James Nixie, the former director of Russia and Eurasia, he says, good morning to all of you, gentlemen and ladies. And the question is a bit hypothetical, and he understands that, you know, it's a speculative alternative history, but what might have been what would our world look like today if Ukraine were provided all the necessary military kit, the Taurus tank-stopping landmines, air protection, possibly the Sky Shield that there has been a discussion a lot. Could we be bringing Ukrainian victory closer?
Well, let's take it back even further than that. Because what if in October, November of 2021, when Western powers were fully aware what Russia was planning, they had decided, instead of deciding that there was nothing they could do about it, to actually do something.
Yes.
If there had been the kind of support for Ukraine that was designed to deter Russia from attacking, as opposed to the endless diplomatic processions to Moscow to try to cajole President Putin out of doing something that he had his mind set on by saying, we know exactly what you're going to do, but we're not actually going to do anything to stop you, then we could possibly have had the start of the process, the long process of turning Russia into a country that is deterred and has had boundaries set for its behavior. And that is the only way we are, over the long term, going to remove the only hard security threat to the European continent. But instead, that process did not start, and so Russia continues the pattern of its post-colonial wars, bringing it what looks like success on Russian terms. Until that changes, this will never stop, and until Russia itself changes, we are always going to have this problem.
And that actually, I want to bring Arseniy because I would even go further to October 2021, but to a spring of 2014, when Russians invaded Crimea in the first place. And we do know now from open archives and sources that Americans were openly dissuading Ukrainians from mounting resistance, and the price that Russia paid for that great transgression of international law was non-existent, to be honest. So, I mean, Arseniy, what do you think at that time, back from 2014 to 2021, was stopping Western partners of Ukraine, if you can call them like that, to actually see that if Ukraine is not armed, you remember the whole discussion about whether Ukraine should and shouldn't be given lethal weapons. We are far away from that, but it was the case. Could Ukraine be given lethal weapons to defend itself? This was a legitimate question all over the media. What did you hear then from Ukraine, from Berlin, from Paris, from London, and how did that lead to where we are today?
You know, I admire all these ifs and buts, but here is the thing: we don't have the time machine. So we can draw the lessons out of what has happened a decade ago. Because let me remind you that this war has been going on for 11 years, but not for 3.5 years. Putin illegally invaded Crimea in 2014. And there was no political will on the side of our allies to provide Ukraine either with a lethal weapon or to give a real membership perspective in NATO for Ukraine. I was the Speaker of the House in 2008, and I hosted the then President of the United States in Kiev, who did everything in order to get this map. But in the end, in Bucharest, we were refused to get map for Ukraine.
Membership action plan for NATO.
Yeah, membership action plan for NATO. It's a kind of entrance to NATO. What happened in the end? Putin invaded Georgia and moved to Crimea and to the east of Ukraine. So let me put it this way. We are well aware this inconsistency and a lack of guts and balls drive us to the situation where we are right now. Right now, we are at an inflection point. The price is skyrocketing if we waste the time and if we drag our feet. So here is the lesson. If the West decides, I mean the West, the US administration, the European Union, and the UK, and I really commend the United Kingdom. Yesterday I met your former Chief of Defense, Admiral Radakin. Your decision to provide Storm Shadow missiles and Challenger tanks to Ukraine was a sea change. It was a game changer in the decision-making process of the entire West. So here is the thing, what is needed? So first, we need an additional security supplemental for Ukraine from the US administration and from the European Union. Second, we need to get a real financial support. The budget gap is around $170 billion in the forthcoming 3 years. Fourth, we urgently need to increase the military production capacities, both in the European Union and in Ukraine. We make cheaper, better, and quicker, I mean in Ukraine. So please give us cash in order to provide Ukrainian military with the necessary ammo. Fourth, we need urgently to confiscate Russian assets because you guys are facing tremendous financial problems. And we have the source, which is completely in line with the international law. And I can elaborate on this, why it is in line with the international law to make Russia accountable and to confiscate Russian assets. And last but not least, China and India, those who support Russia and those who help Russia to circumvent sanctions. So we need to hold the dialogue with India and to press on China. This is the menu I've got out of these 11 years of indecisiveness, okay, that we faced. In terms of, Kir, with all due respect, you said about Russia and Russia's defeat. I know that you worked in Moscow, so you have the reading on Moscow. The problem is I was born in the Soviet Union. I have the reading of Moscovites too. So we have to realize that Russia is not the normal state since 2014, because we are still applying all these patterns of the institution, flag, state anthem, democracy, elected government, Duma. Look, from the time Putin blatantly violated an international law and illegally annexed Crimea, even starting with the Georgia, it became a mafia-style state, chaired by KGB operatives. So, as of now, this state is completely on the war footing. He isn't eager to accomplish this war because in case if he get any kind of ceasefire or peace deal with Ukraine, this will be a clear-cut threat to him personally. Yeah. That's the way dictators live. And we have to realize this. And we still look at Russia as, look, it is the country, it is a P5 member, they created the UN, that it's not no longer. So we have to look at Russia as a warmonger, as a mafia state, which has nothing to do with the real, I mean, normal country, with the normal institutions. Because Putin always used these kind of misreadings. And this is the best way how to play us. If we look, if it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. So it's a duck, okay?
Yeah, I think this is important to have a clarity of judgment to call the spade, like you're basically saying, because part of the narrative power of Russia, which some people are already aware of, previously it wasn't so much even aware of, is in playing with our perception of reality and trying to convince us that perhaps their reading or their version of reality is more correct. And I think this is the danger where Trump is, in a way, where he was validating Putin's version of events, Putin's interpretation of Russian invasion of Ukraine, that, I'm sure will come up in questions. But Kir, would you like to add more things to Arseny's list of what do you want to see, or what should we be watching to know that things are moving in the right directions for Ukraine, or perhaps being warned of that things may deteriorate in the future, near future?
I'd like to actually respond to that, not quite with a laundry list, but instead with an underlying principle that I still think we need to apply in a lot of capitals in Europe and in Canada and around the world. Because let's not forget that although this is a global conflict, it is not just in Europe and North America, that there are democracies that stand for the rules-based international order and want to arrest the slide into that global conflict that we're seeing. We regularly interact with colleagues from countries like Japan, Australia, North Korea, South Korea, looking for...
They did it. up in North Korea. You're right.
Yes.
Looking for ways in which these countries can come together to protect their shared interests, and then realizing with a certain amount of bemusement that there is limited engagement with Europe for understanding the problem and then doing something about it. But I think that in itself is a symptom of the problem that I'm coming on to, which is overcoming the mental capture of past ideas of how Europe works. The mental capture of this picture of Russia that has been so successfully sold despite being so different from reality. The idea, in particular, that Russia is too powerful, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be confronted, and that it is impossible to defeat or deter Russia, which is an idea that is still deeply rooted in a lot of the conversations we have about possible futures for confronting Russia, because it has been built up over so many decades. And it doesn't matter how much evidence you bring from past performance, not only of the current leadership, but of the country through decades and centuries, it is still deeply, deeply embedded. So it is a case of changing not just minds, but mindsets, changing assumptions about, first of all, the scale and nature of the challenge and how bad it will be if Europe and like-minded friends around the world do not respond. And secondly, that Europe has agency, that it is possible to insert European countries into a conversation about their future in a manner that is relevant, instead of them sitting by helplessly and talking about coalitions of the willing, but willing being different from able and being different from capable of stepping in before the problem is resolved rather than after. All of these things are just symptoms of that mental paralysis, that mental capture that has dogged Western responses to Russian aggression over the course of decades. And the trick, I think, is getting over that before it is too late.
Yeah, I think one of the realizations inside Ukraine, if you go and talk to people, is that there's a clear understanding that Ukraine has opened a window of opportunity to create a different future, both for Ukraine and for Russia, for the same matter, if Russia is defeated in this war in Ukraine. And the West is too timid to, grasp it and to exploit it and to work with Ukraine, not just as a, at arm's length, but as a true ally in order to reshape what we all want, how we coexist on the European continent. That this is the continent of the smallest size and the biggest diversity, whereas Russia is the big landmass with no diversity at all. So there are all kinds of conceptual conflicts entrenched already in that existence. But I think what also, I'm sure, Arseniy, you would agree, there's a lot of anger in Ukraine that we are wasting time, that we are doing everything that we said impossible at the beginning too late. And this drip feeding of Ukraine's battlefield capability actually turns war in Russia in favor of creating it as a war of attrition, which they think so far they can win. But I'll open now the floor to questions from the audience. I see already lots of hands, so let's bring on the lights. Let's please introduce yourself, and I'll take 2-3 questions. Try to be brief, because as you can see, there's a lot to come. Please, ladies in the first.
Thea Tutberidze, King's College London, War Studies Department. First of all, thank you so much. It's fascinating discussion.